All right, let me start sharing my screen. Okay, so before we begin, let me just have a quick introduction of myself. My name is Mia. I am currently a third-year student majoring in DBI. I have been working for PAW for almost 3 semesters now. So yeah, all right. So let's begin our workshop today on writing with more impact. So just the first quick question. What do you think is the most important purpose of an academic paper? Well, feel free to turn on your mic and answer the question or type it out in the chat. So any ideas?
I think it's to like argue a point that you're stating.
Mm-hmm. So something, a point like in your thesis statement?
Yes, kind of like
Okay.
that.
Okay, good one. Anyone else? Any other ideas? Okay, so like Daryl said, the two most important purposes of an academic paper is to, first of all, elaborate on the author's thesis statement. And the second purpose of it is to demonstrate the author's knowledge through the research and the thought process that is presented in the paper's writing. So the reason why we want to, add more impact to our writing is that sometimes even when we have really good research and ideas and organized content overall, somehow our paper just, in the end, it doesn't really able to effectively communicate our ideas. And because of that, it doesn't really achieve the impact that we as writer desire, which is why we want to add more impact to our writing so that we can better convince the readers of our opinion and we can inspire them to, to take certain actions that we want them to take after, reading through our paper, for example. So, which is why we are having our workshop today to take our writing, a step further in effectively, deliver our ideas and to help our paper achieve, its fullest potential. Okay, so what we will cover today in our workshop is, first of all, we will take a look at what makes a paper impactful. Then we will take a look at each of the criteria in detail. And then we will have a final notes and summary at the end, as well as a Q&A session. So first, what makes a paper impactful? I think I kind of spoiled myself a little bit there earlier. So there are 4 criteria. First one is the content, which is the result of your brainstorming, researching, planning, and organizing that is going to be manifested in your outline and in your draft later, right? And the second criteria is approachability, which is how understandable and your paper is to the audience. Third is the flow, which is how likely is your paper to capture and maintain the audience focus and interest from start to finish. And fourth is the impression, which is your paper's ability to leave a lasting impression on the readers. Now, knowing these 4 criteria, which one of them do you think that we should prioritize?
May I see the 4 criteria again?
Yes, of course. So we have content, approachability, flow, and impression. So which do you think that we should prioritize? Any ideas? Okay, well, Well, maybe if you guys are thinking that we should prioritize content, then you are correct. Because writing an impactful paper should always start from having a well-researched and organized content, right? Because without quality substance, then whatever effort you're putting into, making your paper seem more impressive is not going to be really effective, especially when the person reading your paper is your teacher or your professor who has a lot of knowledge of your topic. If they find out that you don't really have a clear idea of what you're writing about, then it's going to be pretty hard for you to convince them, which is why we always want to prioritize our researching and organizing. I think that at this point, a lot of you in AC1 and AC2 have already learned about, how to write an outline and how to do your research in your ART class. So our workshop today is actually not going to focus too much on content, but we will focus on the other three criteria, focus on how we can, build up more quality into your paper after you have constructed your outline and, you're having your first draft done. But I do want to point out that content is always something that you should prioritize when you are writing an academic paper. Okay, so with this out of the way, let's have a look at our second criteria, which is approachability. So why would we want to make our paper more approachable? Well, if you are able to help your readers understand clearly about your topic, you would be more likely to convince them of your thesis statement or your argument, right? And another thing is, for a lot of you here who are taking AC1 and AC2 classes, the audience of your paper is most likely going to be your classmates and your teachers, who might not necessarily have the same level of background knowledge on the same topic as you, right? Not everyone in your class is taking the same major in the same classes as you, so they might not really understand all the phrases, the terminologies in your topic, for example. So if you are able to help them understand the context, the background of your paper more, you are more likely going to receive more specific, on-point, and helpful feedback and suggestions from them during peer review sessions, which is why we want to help have our paper to be more understandable, right? So what can we do to make our paper more approachable or understandable? There are several things that we can do. We can provide explanations and definitions. We can write our sentence clearly and digestibly. We can choose our words wisely, and we can also present our evidence appropriately. So let's take a look at each of these methods. First, we have explanations and definitions. Now, what we want to do is, this is something I tell students to do a lot of the time, is to put yourself in the audience perspective and ask yourself whether or not you can understand the paper or understand a certain phrase or topic, assuming that you have little to no background knowledge. Like I said earlier, your paper's audience most likely is going to be the public audience, your AC1 classmate and your teachers. So you always want to put yourself into the audience perspective, because you're writing your paper, for an audience. You're not just writing for yourself. So yeah. And during the peer review sessions, you can also pay attention to the feedback from your classmates. If you find yourself getting a lot of questions asking about a certain phrase or a word, like what does it mean, chances are that you're not providing enough explanations or definition for them, or your explanation is not clear enough and you need to go back and revise them, right? And you can also try to take the initiative and ask your peer reviewers and your teachers, like, hey, is there any words or phrase in my writing that you find it confusing or you don't really understand? Can you tell me? And by taking the initiative like that, you can get the feedback from your readers, the audience, and then you can go back and improve your explanations and your definitions, right? Another thing is, for certain phrases, words in your writing that has a lot of more than one way to interpret, do make sure that in your writing you are specifying which interpretation you are using to refer to that certain word or term. So let me give you an example of my old AC2 research paper on the topic of data analytics in esports industry. So here I was defining esports. So I gave two definitions, one coming from an academic source, and the second one is pulling from practical context. So after giving these two definitions, I specify that I will be using the first definition in the journal article because it is more comprehensive in terms of scope, which makes it more suitable for my purpose of the research. So I will be using the first one. So that's what you can do in your writing. So you can specify which definition exactly that you are using to refer to this certain words or phrase. Now, the second thing that we can do to make our writing more approachable is focus on the clarity of our sentence. A lot of the time when you're editing the sentence, what you can do is read the sentence out loud. And if you find yourself running out of breath when you're reading it, or if you find yourself losing track of the meaning of the sentence when you are reading it without haven't finishing it yet, chances are that your sentence is a little bit too long and a little bit too confusing. So that's a sign that you need to go back and edit this sentence. There are several ways that you can deal with long, confusing sentences. First thing, pretty straightforward, is separate it into shorter sentences. A lot of the time, your lengthy sentences is the result of you putting your main independent clause, like the subject verb clause, that main clause is being connected with, very long supplementary phrases. So what you can do is you can separate the information from those long supplementary phrases into a different sentence, and then you connect it to the main independent clause. And you can connect them using conjunction phrases or pronouns. I will show you an example later to show you what I mean by it. Another way that you can do it is that if your sentence is not able to be separated into shorter sentences because it is long because it contains a long list with long complex list item, what you can do is that instead of using your comma to separate the list items, you can use semicolons to separate those list items. Okay, let's take a look at an example here of how I separated. So this here used to be a very long sentence that basically I was talking about how data analytics can be particularly potential in esports because of data availability, accessibility, and volume of esports data. And when I write it in one sentence, I realized that it's too long. I literally ran out of breath while I was reading it. So I ended up splitting it into two like this. So the first entire sentence, I was making the claim that data analytics can be particularly well suited for esports. And then I connected to the second sentence where I explain why it is the case. And between these two sentences, I use the pronoun this to refer to entire claim that I made in the first sentence. And then I connect it to the following sentence. So that's how I managed to separate a long sentence into two and then connect them together. Now, another thing that you can do to make your writing more understandable is to think of your word choice. A lot of the time, from my experience as a PAW, I had a lot of students asking me, how to make their paper sound more academic, how to make their word choice more academic. A lot of the time students, mistake that sounding academic means that you're using a lot of uncommon advanced word, but it's not always effective, especially if you don't have, quality content and ideas to match your, those advanced uncommon words, right? Again, like I said earlier about having good content is always something that you should be prioritizing. And sounding academic is not necessarily the same as being academic in your writing. Being academic in your writing means that your writing needs to have a solid structure, solid outline. You need to have persuasive reasoning for your arguments. You need to have reliable examples to support your reasoning, and you need to have meaningful analysis adding up to all of that. Now, so being academic is more important than just sounding academic. But what if we want to, still kind of show off our knowledge through those academic words? When do we want to use them? My advice is a lot of the time you would want to stick to the vocabulary that you already know, that you know clearly the meaning of the word, when to use them, the connotation of the word, the tone of the word. Stick to those, and then only use the big words when they are irreplaceable technical terms. If you try to use academic advanced word when you don't really know the meaning of, if you end up using like the wrong word with the wrong connotations, it can actually backfire, and the readers can misunderstand your intention entirely. Now, other than word choice, we can also think of how we want to present our evidence. There are three ways for us to kind of present our evidence from external sources. We can paraphrase it, we can quote it, or we can summarize it. When we are paraphrasing an evidence, we want to be as concise and as understandable as possible. The purpose of us when we are trying to present an evidence is to provide support for our claims, for our arguments, and to make the readers understand, our reasoning better. So if we somehow, through our paraphrasing, we make our evidence seems even more complex and harder to understand, then it kind of defeats the purpose of trying to support our evidence, right? So our goal here is paraphrase it in a way that is concise and understandable as possible. Now, when it comes to quoting, sometimes you don't really want to quote that long chunk of text. Sometimes you just need maybe 1 or 2 sentences from that entire paragraph. So what you can do is that in between those sentences, you can use ellipsis points to skip out all the unnecessary information and to keep the main ideas only. Similarly, when we are summarizing, we often do this when we want to cite some conclusions or findings from a certain study or research paper, but we don't really need to summarize all of them, right? Sometimes a paper comes to several conclusions, but maybe only 1 or 2 of them is really relevant to what you are discussing. So what you can do when you're summarizing is to pick out only the relevant main ideas, relevant findings that you can actually use for this certain point that you are discussing. So doing this will keep your evidence presentation concise and understandable, which in turn will make your paper as more approachable to your readers. Now, for AC2 research papers specifically, approachability, a lot of it depends on your background section. And the two common problems with this section is under-explaining and over-explaining. Under-explaining is just meaning that you are kind of lacking definitions, explanation. And what you can do with this is, well, you provide more explanation, using the advice that I was talking about earlier. But over-explaining is when you are giving a lot of background information, you're giving a lot of statistics, you're giving a lot of data, but then altogether they don't combine into like a coherent big picture of the background. So what you can do to resolve this problem is that you consider several of these questions when you are including some background information. So the first thing is, why did you include this piece of contextual information? Does it help your readers to understand the context? How exactly do they help? And then how do all of your background information pieces create the background picture altogether? And fourth is, does the background information or the statistics play an important role in validating your point? Is it really important in convincing your readers that your main points that is important? If it is, then yes, it should be included in the background section. If you find yourself that, if you find out that your point would still matter anyway, with or without that background information, then maybe consider leaving it out for the sake of being concise, right? Now with this out of the way, let's move on to the flow, the third criteria. We want to create a more interesting flow in our writing, because if we're not able to maintain your readers' attention and interest throughout the paper, then, well, they might not, really focus on your argument, and altogether they won't be as convinced. And our goal here is not only to attract their attention at the beginning, we also want to maintain it towards the end. So what can we do? We can have a well-structured outline, and then after that, we can focus on creating a good flow in our introduction and in the body. And in the introduction, we can create a good hook, we can create good transition from the hook to the thesis statement. And in the body section, we can use appropriate conjunctions to connect our sentences, connect our paragraphs. We can also try to be versatile with our sentence types, expressions, and tones as well. So for the outline structure, what we can do is we take a zoom out and a zoom in look. When we take a zoom out look, we want to look at the organization of our different sections or different paragraphs, headings, and we want to see how readable your paper looks when one skims through it. And when it comes to the zoom in look, you want to examine how clear your ideas and your sentences are within each of the paragraphs. So here's a question that I get a lot from students, but now I want to ask you guys, what do you guys think make a good hook? Any thoughts?
A hook that it can represent what this paper is supposed to be about, but it's also interesting enough that the reader wants to read it.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. So we want our hook to be, attention grabbing, and we also want our hook to be kind of relevant to what we are going to discuss, right? Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. So actually, I think that, a good hook is something that is kind of hard to define because it varies depend on your topic, your scope, your controlling ideas, and also on the personal perception of the reader. You might think that something makes a good hook, but your readers might think it's meh, it's okay. So what we can ask instead is, what would, immediately inform your readers about your topic? So like Fiona said earlier, a good hook is something that is attention grabbing for sure, but it should also be relevant to your topic. So your hook should be something that can give a slight hint or some in a way inform the readers about your topic. And what you can do it when you're thinking of what to write for your hook is you can consider something that your readers would associate with the keywords of your topic. And be careful that you're not making things up when you're writing a hook, because sure, a hook can be attention grabbing, but you should not use any misinformation or untruthful data, statistics when you're writing a hook. And if you're using, external data or statistics, make sure you cite them, even if it's a hook, okay? We are writing an academic paper, so, being truthful, being reliable is always important. So here's an example of how I came up with this hook for my, research paper. So the topic has a lot to do with esports, data analytics. So I sat down and think of what the readers would associate with esports. So I think of what are some of the popular video games, some popular esports. So I picked League of Legends because it's quite popular at the time, and I also like to play League of Legends. So from there, I think of, what are some kind of events that is related to League of Legends. And at the time I was writing this in spring 2020, the most recent big event featuring the game was the 2019 World Championship that took place like just a few months before that. So I use this in my hook, and I use the number of viewership that during this event to kind of create an attention grabbing hook, because 4 million viewers at the time was really high. It will attract the attention of the readers, and it is also relevant to what I'm about to write about esports, right? Okay, so after the hook, what we want to do is that we want to transition to the thesis. And I think a lot of you here are probably familiar with this, structure of the introduction already. What we want to do is that we want to create a seamless flow throughout the introduction. So each of the elements here should be related to each other. And when we look at this, we also want to think of how we want to, narrow down the scope, because, your topic needs to start from, so in the hook, we start from something wide, like in the topic. So I started from esports, but then when I transition onto, the thesis statement in my paper, I need to somehow bring up esports analytics. So I need to somehow in the transition, move from esports, narrow it down to esports analytics, right? So there are several ways that we can transition from the hook to the thesis statement in our introduction. We can talk about the topic's importance or urgency. This strategy kind of works for a lot of, essay types and a lot of topics. It's kind of no-brainer, and you can use it a lot of the time. We can also discuss, the context of the topic, especially if you are writing a cause and effect paper or a problem and solution paper. And also if you're writing about a pretty controversial topic or contentious topic, or if you're writing an argumentative paper, what you can do in the introduction transition is that you can give an outline of the debate, or you can, summarize some relevant theory or research regarding this topic. Also, if you are writing about a new topic, or a topic that has a lot to do with some technical terms or keywords, then what you can do in your transition is that you can give a brief definition of those key terms. Some advice for the introduction, though, is we want to keep the introduction brief. We don't want to go too deep into details in the introduction, and our transition should be within just 2 to 4 sentences. And especially for those of you writing AC2 research paper, because we're going to have like an entire background section following the introduction, we want to keep a lot of our details of the background or the topic in the background section. So we don't want to spoil too much in the introduction, right? Also, you might want to consider, including an extra sentence explaining the outline of your paper, or you can make sure that your thesis statement will reflect the paper's outline by itself. Okay, so after we are done with the introduction, what we can do in the body section to make sure we have a more interesting flow is, first thing that we can think of is using appropriate conjunctions. It's pretty easy, but a lot of students make the mistake of overusing conjunctions when the logical relationship between the sentences and the paragraphs are pretty self-evident. So we only want to use conjunctions when the logical relationship might be ambiguous or it needs to be emphasized. We don't want to overuse them. And a tip here is, sometimes if you need to mention something that you have discussed in a previous paragraph, you can use some reminder conjunction phrases like as previously discussed or previously mentioned. This will help your readers remember that, oh, you have discussed this before, oh, you have mentioned this before. And this will keep them, focused, and you will keep them, staying on track with the flow of your paper. So here's an example of how I use conjunctions to emphasize the logical relationship between these two sections in my paper. So I have a first section talking about the overview of the esports industry. Basically, I was talking about how esports is growing to be more popular and more competitive. And then I moved on to talking about the implications for esports stakeholders. So in between these two sections, in order to emphasize the cause and effect relationship between the esports industry development and the implication for esports stakeholder, I use this conjunction phrase against such backdrop to represent the relationship between them and to emphasize on that logical relationship. So that's an example of what you can think of when you want to use conjunctions appropriately at the right place and at the right time. Other than conjunctions, in our writing, we can also try to be versatile with our sentence types and expressions. We can try to use a mix of different sentence types. So we can use simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. And if we're able to use a mix of this, then our writing would sound less monotonous. And also, when it comes to the expression and the tone, you can think of the purpose of your sentence to choose the appropriate phrase and sentence structure. So in a certain paragraph, each of your sentence will serve a certain purpose, right? We have the topic sentence to give a brief overview of what you're talking about in that paragraph. We also have explanation sentence to elaborate on what you said in the previous sentence. We also have, a sentence to present a certain opinion if we're talking about a certain debate. So each of the sentence will serve a certain purpose in your writing. So whenever you're writing a certain sentence, you can think of what you want to say, what you want this sentence to serve as in that body paragraph, so that you can choose the appropriate phrase and expression to write it. And the QR code that you're seeing on the screen right now is going to link you to a certain reference material called They Say, I Say. That is going to include a lot of example, expression, and phrase and sentence structures that you can use for various different purposes. It's pretty good, but we don't have enough time to cover this in our workshop today, which is why I'm just including the QR code here. So you can scan it and take a look at it by yourself. And also, the tone of your speech can sometimes be influenced by your rhetorical strategy. And for this one, I think that we had Paul, also had a workshop earlier. I think it was a few weeks before about language and thesis. And so what you can do is you can later go on to the PAW's YouTube channel to find this workshop, or I can show you guys later of how to find that recording for the workshop so that you can refer to. And here's a tip for when you are editing a sentence. What you want to do is, again, think of the purpose of the sentence, what you want to say with the sentence. And also, if it is a long sentence with a lot of components, think of what components you want to highlight. For example, if let's say if you're talking about the difference of these two countries and in a certain statistics. So if you want to highlight a certain components, maybe consider phrasing your sentence in a way that maybe it starts with what you want to emphasize on, and putting it into the main independent clause of that sentence, and all the other information should come in the supplementary clause. So basically you want to phrase your sentence in a way that clearly represent your intention and your emphasis. Now moving on, we have our last criteria, which is the impression. So we want our paper to have a more lasting impression, because we not only just want to start our paper very impressively, but then towards the end, if we don't wow our readers, then you're not going to leave like a lasting memory in their mind about your paper, right? And this is especially important if our paper is trying to advocate for a certain message or a call to action, or when you're trying to convince them of a certain argument. If you don't really leave a lasting impression in your reader's mind, it's not going, your writing is not going to be as effective in, delivering your message, right? And also, if you are able to leave a more lasting impression, it also means that your paper has more chance to stand out among other papers. So what are the keys to leaving a more lasting impression in your writing? So for an AC2 research paper and other, literature review that you might find yourself writing in your future classes, the first key to a lasting impression writing is having a well-developed discussion section. And then the second one is that is going to apply for all of your academic writing is having a strong conclusion as well. And the keyword for both of these sections that we want to take note of is the takeaway. What exactly do you want to remain in your reader's memory about your paper? Now, let's take a look at the discussion section and how we can make it more, lasting. A lot of us, when we started writing our first research paper in AC2, are kind of confused of what the discussion section is about, what we are supposed to do in it, what we are supposed to write. So a discussion is, simply put, an extension of your previous analysis to showcase the meaning, relevance, and importance of your research. Now, there are several elements that is going to constitute to, a well-developed discussion section, which are interpretation, implications, limitations, and recommendations. Of these four elements, I would say the two most important elements that you have to have almost all of the time is interpretation and implications. The other two, limitations and recommendation, are kind of optional, but I would still recommend that you try to incorporate them in your discussion as well, especially the limitation. It's optional, but I would highly recommend you guys to include limitations in your discussion. So there are several questions that we want to consider for each of these elements. So let's start with interpretation. So if your research is based on a lot of statistical or data evidence, is there any certain correlation or pattern or relationship among those evidence that you think your readers should take note of or should be emphasized? And secondly, if your research is based on a hypothesis, then did the result meet your expectation? Did your result prove that your hypothesis was correct or not? And thirdly, if your finding is, if you're researching about a topic where a lot of previous research have discussed, then how does your finding align with or stand out among those existing literature? And also, did you come across any unexpected result during your research, right? Sometimes your research does prove that your hypothesis is correct, but when you're researching, you find out that, oh, this is kind of unexpected. Oh, I did not consider this, but it comes up during my research. So those are kind of some of the unexpected results, right? And if they are significant enough, then try to also include them in your interpretation as well. And lastly, are there any results from your research that you want to emphasize or highlight by mentioning it first? Your research might come to a lot of conclusion, but maybe you want to highlight one or two of them. So you can do that by mentioning it first when you are summarizing them. What we want to achieve with the interpretation is we want to explain how significant and effective your results are in answering your research question. This might seem obvious to you as the reader, as the one who did all the research and organizing, but to your readers who did not do all the research and who are just reading your paper, then it's still important for you to explain all of this to them, which is why we need to have this interpretation session in our discussion. Now, moving on from interpretation, we have implication. What we want to consider is that if your research aligns with previous findings in studies, are there any new insights or new contribution that your paper can add to this discussion? Second, if your research is different, if it deviates from previous literatures, then what is the reason or what is the context for such difference? And third, pretty straightforward, is what are the practical implications of your results for the researchers, for the audience, for relevant stakeholders of your topic? Basically, what this means is what can those people do with the result of your paper, of your research, right? So here, for implication, we want to demonstrate the contribution of your research, to the academic discussion of your topic, and why the reader should care about it. What can they do about it? Moving on from those two most important elements in the discussion, we also have some other optional elements that we want to consider is limitations and recommendations, right? So for limitations, we want to address what is within the scope of our research and what is not. And for each of the limitations that we specify, we don't want to just list them out. We also want to explain how they affect the interpretation of your result. For example, if your paper is not covering, if your research scope is just covering mostly mobile games and FPS game, like for the other research paper that I gave you an example of, then can my research result be concluded for all, esports genres? Most likely not, right? Because most of the examples that I was using in that research paper that I wrote, mostly regarding the MOBA games and FPS games like League of Legends, Valorant, Counter-Strike. So maybe my research result is not going to be applicable for different games like card games or auto battler games. And third is when we have a lot of limitations, like several limitations in our research, then we want to consider, do all of them have a direct impact on your research objective? And we only want to include the ones that really have an impact on our research objective. And we want to answer how exactly do they impact your attempt to achieve the research aim. We don't want to list out too many limitations, because if you do so, you're kind of giving your readers the impression that, oh, this paper might not be as reliable, as trustworthy, because there are so many limitations. So we only want to focus on the one that really have an impact on the research objective. So what we're doing here in acknowledging our limitation is that we are demonstrating that we are objective in our judgment, right? Because no research, no paper is perfect. Even the one written by, very well-educated people, by professors, even those research suffer from certain limitations, right? And us as a student, when we are acknowledging the limitations of our research, we are demonstrating our credibility, and we are demonstrating the fact that we are willingness to open to judgments, and we are viewing our writing objectively, right? And after acknowledging our limitations, we also want to reiterate the validity of our research despite those limitations. We don't want to undermine our research. We want to emphasize the fact that our research result still matters, even with these limitations. And that is going to further convince your readers of the significance and importance of your research. Now, lastly, for the recommendations, sometimes certain implications and limitations that you listed previously in the discussion might suggest some ideas for future studies. And if that's the case, if you can think of some future studies based on the limitations that you found out in your research, those could be some good ideas that you can include as, suggestions for future studies. And when you are thinking of suggestions, don't just limit yourself to within the scope of the field of your topic, but sometimes some relevant field of studies outside of your topic might also benefit from your research result. So think of those and you might be able to come up with really good recommendations in your paper. Again, what we want to do here is we want to explain what should the stakeholders, the researchers, or the audience do with the result of the research. Now, moving on from the discussion, the last part that we are going to cover is the conclusion. So the conclusion is pretty much a reverse introduction, right? And again, the emphasis here is what do we want our takeaway in the conclusion to be? What we want the readers to remember after they have finished reading our paper. So there are several ways that you can wrap up your conclusion and leave an impression on your readers. You can try to answer a so what question, which means you want to answer what is your paper ultimate purpose and why is it worth the attention and the discussion, not only just for the time being, but maybe also in the foreseeable future. We can also try to tie back to a hook. For example, if you start your paper with a hook in the form of a question, then maybe you can end your conclusion with maybe a response to that question. It's going to create a pretty consistent flow from the beginning towards the end as well, right? We can also wrap up our conclusion by, presenting some food for thought or a call to action. So maybe there is a question that still remains after all of your research. You can present it, kind of giving it an open-ended sense to your reading, to your paper. Maybe you would want to emphasize or double down on the actions or the solutions that you want to advocate for. Several things that you should do and should not do in your conclusion. First is we don't want to just repeat the thesis statement and the main points. I think this is pretty obvious, especially for those of you writing AC2 research paper. We have an entire discussion section where you are basically extending on your analysis. So what we want to do is we also want to include the key analysis, the key insights from both of your body sections and your discussion section in the summary within your conclusion. And we want to demonstrate through all of these summary that your research is important and significant. And we don't want to include new ideas or evidence in our conclusion. We want to either mention them in the body paragraphs, in the body section, or if you don't, then maybe leave them out altogether. Okay, so with that, let's wrap up before we move on to the Q&A session. So we have discovered there are 4 aspects to impactful writing: content, approachability, flow, and impression. For the content, like I mentioned before, this is something that you always should prioritize in your research and your planning. Secondly, for approachability, you want to identify and understand the level of knowledge that your target audience have about your topic. And we want to write our paper in a way that is the most understandable to them. And for the flow, we want to present the logical connections in your paper as clearly as possible. The logical connection that I'm talking about here is not just between your sentences, but also between your paragraphs, between your sections in the paper, a lot of those here. So you want to present them as clearly as possible. And for the impression, we want to identify what exactly we want the readers to take away from our writing. And we also want our writing to, in the discussion and in the conclusion, to remind the readers of your paper's significance. Okay, and the last piece of advice, writing an academic paper is, pretty much like a marathon. And so it requires consistent effort. Yeah, so stay motivated and I'll keep striving for improvement. Okay, so with this, I think we are coming to an end of our workshop presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A session. Before I do so though, here's the attendance form QR code. Please fill that out because it will be closed a few minutes after this. So take your time to fill out the attendance form. And once you're done, feel free to raise any question or thoughts about you have about what we covered today or about AC2, AC1 papers in general. Oh, I have a question about if I want to see today's workshop video again, where can I find it? Yes. So we are going to have this workshop recording posted on the PAW's YouTube channel. So let me just quickly give you guys the link to this YouTube channel. So we actually keep the recording of most of our research, of our workshop on this channel. Let me copy the link to it here. Okay, so I'm sending the link to the PAW's YouTube channel. Yeah, do consider checking it out and subscribe to it so that you can see a lot of workshops that we have and events that we have, promotions as well. Okay, so if you're having trouble with the QR code for the attendance form, please message me privately in the chat so that I can send it out to you personally. Here. Okay, so is there any question that you guys want to ask about today's workshop? Any questions, thoughts? Feel free to turn on your mic and tell us what you think, or you can type it out in the chat. I have a question about the attention grabbing introduction technique. So like I said earlier, what we can do to make our hook kind of attention grabbing is when we think of the keywords that is often associated with our topic, we can pick out something, maybe we can choose some statistics that is really impressing or might be surprising to a lot of the readers. Like what I did earlier was when I choose to include the information about the number of viewers, the peak viewers during the World Championship event, which was really high. And that's going to help in grabbing the attention of those readers. Or you can think of some recent events, like some recent shocking events that would probably also help with attracting the attention of your readers. Yeah, also sometimes you can include some interesting facts about your topic as well. So a lot of things that you can do, a lot of things that you yourself think might be shocking, interesting, will be able to grab the attention of your readers pretty well. And another question, so limitation and recommendation were necessarily in ARL, but they are not necessarily for the literature review. What I was saying is that when you are writing an AC2 research paper specifically, perhaps in your ARL also, limitation and recommendation is going to be pretty important that you would want to address. And also in the literature review paper that you are going to write in your future classes, the teacher or your professor might ask you to have a discussion section in that literature review paper. And that is where you might want to consider mentioning the limitations and recommendations that you have, following your research. So the literature review papers that you find yourself writing in your future classes, a lot of it will depend on the instruction of your teacher. So if they ask you to include like a discussion section in your paper specifically, then that's when you might need to have limitations and recommendation. But even if they don't, I would still recommend you guys to maybe bring it up in perhaps your conclusion, or when you are doing the analysis within your each of your body paragraph, for example. So you can still bring them up if you feel like you need to, and especially when your professor or the instruction of the assignment specifically required it. So another question, the student is having a major problem with grammar and afraid that your paper is not grammatically correct, and how you can reduce grammar mistakes and use PAW. Okay, so when it comes to grammar problem, I think that when we're writing a paper, especially in our first draft, second draft, it's pretty hard to make sure that your paper is grammar mistake free. So what we can always do is that we can, proofread your paper. And sometimes I can recommend you guys to use some grammar checking tools like Grammarly, or even Word itself or Google Doc itself also have some, tools to check for grammar mistake or spelling mistake. But then if you are receiving the feedback from your teacher specifically pointing out that you are having a lot of grammar issues in your paper, then that's when you know that those tools might not be enough and you really need to go back and, revise your paper. Obviously, you can come to PAW or academic advising for help. But other than that, outside of those sessions, what you can do is to revise yourself on, grammar knowledge by, maybe you can try to read, papers, reference materials, and try to do some revising exercises online. So maybe those will help with, grammar. A lot of the time, the common grammar mistake that I see students having is either they write incomplete sentence. That's when the sentence doesn't really have like a sufficient independent clause, like the subject plus verb clause. Or sometimes they write really long sentence, but then they were missing out on, conjunctions or punctuations to separate the phrases from each other. You can check out some of the common grammatical mistakes. So you can ask your teachers that, hey, can you tell us what are some of the common grammatical mistakes that you find a lot of students having? And then checking out and then read through your paper to find out if your paper is also suffering from those common mistakes. So that might help. Okay, another question. What's the difference between discussion and conclusion part? Okay, good question here. So in the AC2 research paper specifically, like I said earlier, the discussion is where we extend on our previous analysis. We're not summarizing anything yet in our discussion. We are just, extending on our previous analysis. And what we do is that from the result of our body paragraphs, like a body section, you explain your readers, what you can interpret from all of these results, what you can do with those results, what you cannot conclude with those results, and for the recommendation, what should you do with those results? Those are the things that you are addressing in the discussion. And then in the conclusion, what you're doing is that you're pretty much just summarizing. You talk about, okay, so throughout this entire paper, I have done this. So I have provided background context for my topic. I have analyzed my topic in these and these and these details in the body section. And then I extend on those findings in my discussion by talking about this and this and this. So those are the things that you are doing in the conclusion. And then after all of that, what you want to do is that you wrap it up, and you also want to address how important and how significant your topic is, right? So you want to say something like, okay, so after I have addressed all of this, I want to emphasize that my topic is important because of this and this. So that's what you do in the discussion and the conclusion, and that's what kind of separate them together. Another question, can we emphasize limitations in the body paragraphs, or should it be in the conclusion, in a literature review? If that limitation that you're talking about is regarding something that is like regarding the limitation of your overall research, like especially if the limitation has to do with the scope of your research, then it should be something that you mentioned in the conclusion. But then if the limitation is just regarding that certain part that you are discussing in that one body paragraph, then you should put it in the body paragraph. Does that make sense to you? Oh, okay, great. All right, any other question? Okay, so seeing that none of you guys have any other questions, I think that we can finally wrap up our workshop here. I again would like to thank you to all of you for coming in here today and staying around all towards the end. I hope that this workshop was helpful for you, whether you're taking AC2 classes or if you haven't taken the class yet. So yeah, thank you so much for coming in, and well, keep an eye out for future workshop and events from PAW in the future. And also good luck to all of you in your final exams. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for the session.
Well,
About workshop.
yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.